Okay, good afternoon. Appreciate everybody being here. I'm going to start out by saying I've stacked up before to make entry into a house where we had a known perpetrator inside and didn't feel quite this anxious as I do right now. So, can't hear? How's that? Better? I guess I'll stay leaned up all the time. Maybe we can do something with that on audio. Thank you. Okay. My name is Rich Lacates, Director of Product Management with Central Square Technologies. Been with Central Square now for coming up on a year. But prior to that, and really what the majority of my address to you today is going to be about, is what I experienced when I was in law enforcement. I was a lieutenant commander for 10 years with Clayton County Police Department, just south of Atlanta. And it all started because in 2003, I had to dial 911 for help. I had a crisis in my family, and it was beyond my capacity to provide any kind of resolution to. I had to dial 911, and what showed up wasn't helpful. It wasn't help at all. It was a very shameful and berating experience, and I took that as an opportunity to try and take a look into law enforcement and find out where we had some challenges. I think a lot has changed in the last 10 years, and we're going to go through a lot of the numbers and statistics that show those changes that are taking place, and then what we're trying to do as a technology provider to offer solutions that can help this changing face of law enforcement. I know there's a lot of topics here at IACP. We're going to focus specifically on what we're trying to do with the technology and how we can help you better serve your citizens, because ultimately that's what we're trying to do, is build safer and smarter communities. So, moving forward, that personal experience started with dialing 911 for dispatch and took 5 times before dispatch was even willing to send somebody out to my residence. And then once fire and EMS did arrive, again, it was a very embarrassing situation to start with, and just prior to this session, it was actually a session involved in crisis intervention training. And in speaking with those individuals, I think part of what we need to realize in law enforcement is that every call that we respond to is a crisis. It may not be a crisis for us, but it's certainly a crisis for them. In that context, noticing that sharp contrast between asking for help and not receiving help, that made a significant shift in my perception of how I perceive public safety. I have a family rich in public safety heritage, uncles that were in DEA and Secret Service. A lot of this was back in the 70s and 80s in South Florida. Business was good then, and it continues to be good now. But that experience that I had with 911 soured my perception, and then I realized that's that growing chasm between what the community perceives law enforcement and how law enforcement is actually providing their services to that community. There was no broken laws, there was no illegal activity, but it was still no less a shameful event. So that was in 2003, and then I actually started with Clayton County Police Department. And let's get this working. We tested this. There we go. In 2007, and I realized that making a phone call or writing a letter of complaint to a chief was not going to make a difference. I had seen on TV and had spoken to several law enforcement individuals who were saying, well, if you think you can do a better job, go get a badge and do it yourself. So that's exactly what I did. I was in the corporate America working with Bell South, Sprint PCS in management, and left that corporate career to go into law enforcement and actually applied to the academy. Took my oath to the state and took my oath to the statutes, and then went into the academy, and my first day of academy experience was something that I will never forget, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. For the next 12 weeks of the academy, what I realized was this was the minimum amount of training that was provided by the state to make sure that the state wouldn't be held liable for any actions that an officer performed outside of what they had taught you at the academy. That's the minimum threshold of what we're trying to teach these officers, and that doesn't really prepare them for what they're actually going to experience out on the road. For instance, spent an entire week just doing firearms training. but everybody hopes, even through a 30 or 35 or 40-year career with law enforcement, that you never actually have to pull your gun and use it. At least I hoped that I would never have to. But there's very little that's actually done to help people understand their communities, how to engage with the citizens, and actually how to provide a public service in creating those safer communities. So back to the academy. That first day at the academy was a very interesting experience, to say the least. I don't know how many of you have academies like this, but this was the 5 a.m., get on the bus, get lined up, get off the bus routine, and a lot of yelling, a lot of screaming, a lot of demoralizing activity. And it struck me very odd how familiar that felt to that same night back in 2003 when I dialed 911 for help, and how those officers acted when they arrived on scene for that crisis. And what I realized is we're creating this culture where officers, because they don't have a specific directive, that they're defaulting to an authoritarian role or authoritarian position, because that's something that feels successful to them. They end up thinking that their purpose of going to these calls is to command and be in control, and there's really very little empathy that's provided for these citizens that are in crisis at that time. And that challenge is made even more difficult by all the statistics that we've now began to collect and realize that we're working against as far as agencies go. So, for instance, how can we better protect our citizens, our laws, and better protect ourselves as well? One thing that I saw when I was in law enforcement is there seemed to be this bifurcation that took place, where it was the citizens and us, this very us and them kind of scenario. But I thought it was so odd because everybody that I was working with obviously had a mother and a father. Some of them had brothers and sisters, and some of them even had children as well. And don't they want the same thing that the citizens do? I mean, we're all citizens ourselves, agreed? I mean, we don't get to exclude ourselves as part of that. So there was a great deal of irony in discovering how that perception came about through my experience. So, modern policing by the numbers. U.S. Department of Justice, in the last 20 years, we've seen a 21% increase in the civilian population. It's over 55 million additional people that public safety is responsible for patrolling and servicing. And every time one of those individuals make a call to 911, they're in crisis. What we've also seen is that there's only been an 11% increase in public safety personnel. So for every additional 1,000 citizens, we're only adding one additional officer. And what that's done over this 20-year period is we've actually decreased the officer-to-citizen ratio from 2.4 down to 2.1, 2.17, or down by another quarter of a point. So those increases in call volume, increases in the technology that we're asking our officers to assimilate into their patrol habits, becomes even harder because now they're policing a much larger population than they ever have previously. And they're doing it, again, referring to a prior session, with less social experience, less interpersonal skills than what they've ever had before. I mean, would everybody agree, with the law enforcement personnel that you have right now, that their ability to hold a conversation or de-escalate a situation is probably one of the greatest challenges that you have? Can I see a show of hands? I mean, is that something that you see occurring in your agencies? Absolutely. And it was interesting to me, all the sessions that I've attended while I've been here just the last 2 days, what I saw from a view that I was concerned was going to be very myopic because of my experience directly with the agency that I worked for, may not translate very well to other agencies. But I'm seeing the same problems, the same concerns happening over and over and over again. And this ends up being perceived as a problem that we have across the law enforcement community as a whole. So, moving on. Looking at the points, recidivism rates. 76.6% of offenders are rearrested within 5 years' time. This struck me as very impactful. because 3 out of every 4 arrests that you make, you're going to be arresting those individuals again within a 5-year period. And the numbers don't start out very well to begin with. Within the first year, 56% chance that somebody's going to have a recidivism. Within 3 years, 67%. And then once we get up to 5 years, that's where we're at the 76%. Property crimes, 82% recidivism rates. Drug offenders, 77%. Public order offenders, 74%. Violent offenders, nearly 72%. These are numbers that are difficult to combat, especially when we're answering calls one at a time. So I want to make an argument, and I'm sure some of you will probably disagree with me, so I'm going to ask permission to speak freely. The terminology I'm sure many of you are aware of. I want to suggest that arrests are not an appropriate measure for success. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. Arrests are not an effective measure for the success of an agency. I've never had a commissioner or a city manager or county mayor or city mayor or county manager ever come up to me and ask, how are your arrest numbers? What they do ask is, where are the crimes at now? And where were they this time last year? And are those numbers up or down? And in understanding what they're really asking is, how many victims have been subjected to criminal behavior? We're going about answering the wrong question, and we're addressing the symptoms by making arrests. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be making arrests. We absolutely have to. People break the law. It's our job as law enforcement to enforce that law and make those arrests where appropriate. What I am suggesting is that there's a better way, because for every incident that occurs, there's a cascade of additional events that need to take place, right? If you have an arrest, there's been a crime, or at least you have good knowledge to believe that a crime had been committed. That call came in through a call taker, goes to a dispatcher, sent to an officer. That officer does a report, does the arrest. You have a bookings and corrections officer. CSI has to go out and process the scene. CID supervision has to read the report, assign that to a detective. The detective now has to do the paperwork and do the investigation to make sure that they can carry the case. Then it goes into corrections, because that person's got to have confinement and be held until court. Court, you have bailiffs, additional corrections officers that are there managing that flow. Plus you have prosecuting attorneys, defense attorneys, judges, a jury of 6 people that typically aren't very happy to be there right then. Sometimes that's up to 12 people. And you've completely disrupted their lives yet again. But if we're able to get out and use statistics, use the information and the data that we're collecting, which we're not doing a whole lot with right now. As a matter of fact, Lieutenant of Arlington, Texas, yesterday, they're collecting huge amounts of data and huge amounts of information, but just nothing's being done with it. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do at Central Square, is how can we start looking at new ways of understanding the data so that we can prevent crimes from happening in the first place. How many of you drive exactly the same way when an officer is behind you as when an officer is not behind you? Show of hands. I don't see any hands. All right, how many of you drive differently when there's an officer behind you? All right, so everybody agrees that the presence of an officer affects behavior, right? Can I get a yes? I won't ask for an amen, but yes, okay. Because of that, if we know the best place to put an officer to have presence to prevent a crime from occurring, then that's the best opportunity for us to reduce victimization. Does everybody agree with me so far? That's what we're trying to do. And it's not about predictive policing. To me, I think that's a misnomer. We did start that when I was at the department. I was in charge of the intelligence unit, where we were using intelligence and analytics to try and figure out better ways to be more efficient about how we were operating our agency and how we were serving the citizens. But what I realized is, if you tell an officer this is where a car is most likely to be stolen, or this is where a robbery is most likely to occur, what are they going to do? They go out into those areas and they wait for those crimes to happen so that they can make the apprehension. Because to an officer, that's what success feels like, is making an arrest. And that's because there's a lack of clear direction of what we're trying to fundamentally achieve in law enforcement. And dare I say, we call it public safety. That's part of what we're trying to do, is put the public back into public safety. That's the real measure of how we're successful in these scenarios and in these communities, is preventing people from becoming a victim. Now, I want everybody to think for a second, the last time you drove home from work. Everybody got that in your head? When you got home, did anybody have a door kicked in or a window broken? Show of hands. Nobody? Nobody been burglarized? Did any of you think, good cop? Nobody? I think that's fundamentally part of the issue, is that we're not measuring the right metric for what makes law enforcement successful. That is the true metric, is preventing a crime that didn't happen. It was a standard that I held myself to when I was out there patrolling, to make sure that I was doing as good of a job policing my community of about 13,000 to 14,000 people during my shift on my watch, that I hoped the officer was doing that was protecting my family while I was away. And that was my minimum bar of service to a community. It wasn't the 30 calls or 40 calls that I was dispatched to. It was the other 13,000 homes that I didn't have to stop at, that I was making sure that I was keeping them safe so they could sleep at night. I had the fortune of working for morning watch, 10 at night to 6 in the morning. A lot of good things can go down during that time. But everybody's thought about the sheepdog scenario, right? Protecting the flock. If you're not there protecting the flock because you're off chasing criminals, you've left your flock exposed. And that same analogy plays in this as well. If you have officers that are out there chasing arrests, chasing criminals, then you're leaving a community that you've sworn to protect open to other perpetrators coming in from different venues and taking advantage of your absence while you're off chasing a criminal somewhere else. So, if arrests are not an accurate measure of success, then how do we measure something that didn't happen? This is a question that I get asked often. So, it shouldn't be, how can we measure something that didn't happen? The true question needs to be, how can we prevent our citizens from becoming victims? And that's where big data gives us an opportunity now like we've never had before. It's the opportunity to be in the right place at the right time, but not to prevent a crime from occurring by chasing a specific crime, predictive policing tactics, but rather by engaging the community with a very specific set of activities where the officers are actually directed to engage with the community, either through foot patrol, traffic enforcement, rolling patrol, perhaps you have a bike patrol unit in your agency, community engagement, business engagement, or maybe even educational opportunities, so that you can help the community understand what they can do to help protect themselves as well. And not protect themselves in terms of arming themselves, but so that they don't become subjective to being a victim. I mean, making sure street lights are on, making sure that shrubs aren't up above the windows, making sure that yards are clean, that they're engaged with their community and understand how those particular elements of the broken window syndrome subjects them to becoming a higher probability of a victim. So, individuals want the same thing that you and I want, and that's not to become a victim. And I think we can do that. Has anybody seen the movie Moneyball? Anybody at all? A few of you? It's interesting because people, when I first started proposing these ideas and writing rudimentary AI about 5 or 7 years ago at my agency, they were like, so you're kind of doing Moneyball for policing. I didn't know what they meant. As a matter of fact, I have to admit, I didn't see Moneyball until about 3 months ago. Had to buy it on DVD because I couldn't even download it from Amazon. But one of the quotes in the movie was this: people who run ball clubs, they think in terms of buying players. Your goal shouldn't be to buy players. Your goal should be to buy wins. And in order to buy wins, you need to buy runs. And all of a sudden that dovetailed into what I've been speaking about for several years. And that is people who run and work for police agencies, law enforcement agencies, they think in terms of making arrests. Your goal shouldn't be to make arrests. Arrests are a minimum work product. Instead, your goal should be to prevent crimes. And in order to prevent crimes, what do you need to do? How can you prevent a crime from occurring? I'm going to share a little story. Hurricane Irma that came through last year. We had seen the effects of what had occurred with Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Matthew that had happened in previous years. And in the agency that I was at, just south of Atlanta, we knew that once they gave the evacuation order, we were going to see an exodus of individuals coming out of Florida and moving up into Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina seeking refuge from the storm. No different than what we saw with Hurricane Florence that happened just about a month ago. I went to a CompStat meeting, was responsible to be there every week, do the numbers, do the analysis, and in that particular meeting I said, look, I want us to look at this a little bit different way. What we've seen in previous years is when we have these evacuation orders, every individual that's coming up evacuating from these areas are bringing everything that's valuable with them. These aren't people that are on vacation that are just leaving their house unattended for a couple weeks. These are people that don't even know if they'll have a house to go back home to. They're already in a high stress, distress situation. And what they're going to do is they're going to saturate these hotels and these motels, looking for shelter for a few days, watching the news, wondering if there's anything left, especially when you have hurricanes the size of Matthew and Irma. We've just seen the intensity of these continue to increase year after year. And because those hotels and motels are going to be saturated with these individuals that have everything valuable to them, we're creating a soft, target-rich environment for the perpetrators that are within our jurisdiction. And if we're chasing after those perpetrators, we're not going to be very effective. What we need to do is increase the amount of patrol that we have at hotels and motels along these main thoroughfares and protect these evacuees that are already in a high-stress situation. The following CompStat meeting, I had one of the captains come up to me. His particular area of patrol was right along the interstate, Interstate 75. And he said, look, you were kind of right, but you were mostly wrong because your timing was off. We went out there, and for several hours, about 5 or 6 hours, we patrolled those areas. There wasn't any crime going on, so we left. Now, I'll tell you, an hour later, we started getting phone calls of cars getting broken into. And I thought, how interesting that perspective is, right? I mean, I see some of you smiling, understanding what the quandary is about that problem. Is they weren't measuring their success because they were apprehending criminals. That's what they were looking for, is for somebody to break into a car so that they could put hands on that individual and arrest that person, and that's what felt like success to them, when really the success was is that they were present, preventing people from becoming a victim in the first place. And that's a fundamental culture that exists in law enforcement today and something that we need to change. And I think we have the opportunity to do that. So, our new reality. We have to quit saying, well, that's just the way things have always been done. This is a fundamental flaw in what's taking place, and we have to do better. We have to change how we're looking at this information and how we're protecting these communities. I've been through the list already that talked about all the individuals that are involved when an incident does occur. Does anybody think about how many individuals are involved when an incident doesn't occur? I'll make the argument that there's plenty of money in government. One of the conversations yesterday was Lieutenant Rodriguez was up here from Camden, New Jersey, and they have cameras and surveillance videos, and one of the questions was, how do you afford all this stuff? They were getting it through grants, but I want to make the argument, again, that there's plenty of money in public safety. We're just spending it the wrong way. How is that? It's because we're all waiting until a crime has already occurred before we're involved in that chain. And there's already a litany of processes that has to take place. I mean, think about the money we're spending in personnel and in materials to prosecute somebody that stole $500 or $1,000. I mean, the scale is just so far in the opposite balance. We're spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to prosecute for just a $1,000 crime. If we can prevent that from happening at all, it's not just that we're preventing that $1,000 loss to that victim, but we're also preventing that $10,000 loss to our agencies. And that's money that I'm sure y'all would be happy to spend somewhere else. We see it with the opioid crisis. I make an argument that this is a problem that was fueled and started by big pharma and physicians back in the 90s. They just started indiscriminately assigning pain pills because healthcare was changed, and it was a matter of processing people through as quickly as you could. And in speaking with the chief of the city of High Point, I live just south of Greensboro, but High Point up in Greensboro, North Carolina area, he was telling me that they now have to spend $10,000 to buy Narcan. I thought, how interesting that a pharmaceutical company that created a problem by flooding a market with opioid pills and prescriptions and making those prescriptions even more and more potent to keep up with the tolerance that those patients are building, are now selling the solution for those same patients that are overdosing. That's a fundamental issue. So those additional monies that are being required by law enforcement stretch your resources that are thin already. And how are we addressing that? We're going to try and start treating the problem rather than just continuing to chase after and treat the symptoms. So, what is the impact? Reduce victimization, reduce personnel load demand, and then also reduce quantity of incidents. These are the goals that we're chasing after inside of Central Squared, and we're doing that by applying new technologies. And it's not to take a look at a technology and saying, how can we fit this in or push this into our product line? Rather, it's what solutions are we truly trying to solve, and then what technologies are available that can help us do that. So I've talked about reducing victimization, and I want to show you a couple different examples of how we're using that AI and that technology in these different scenarios. I want to make sure I don't miss any points. So, what's the impact? Oh, let me back up just a minute. One, we're taking business intelligence models and applying that to public safety. All right, business intelligence, how can we be more efficient? How can we maximize our demands and resources and how those loads are being used? I mean, one of the arguments that I see with a lot of law enforcement agencies is that the time of day, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., when they have the least amount of crimes occurring, is when they have to have the heaviest volume of officers on patrol. Why? Because half of them are going to get called down to court to sit in court and testify on cases that they had, which is now keeping resources available from evenings and morning watch as well. If we can prevent crimes from occurring in the first place, they don't have to show up for incidents on cases where they made arrests that didn't even happen in the first. So, what we're trying to figure out is give you real-time information so that you're not waiting for it several weeks or sometimes years. I mean, if you're looking at UCR data, once it's published by the FBI, it's already 1.5 years to nearly 2 years old by the time you're getting it. But we're doing that for your agency on the fly as it's going through. We're doing standardization for nature codes coming out of your CAD system and for your statutes that are already inside of your tables as well, and doing your NIBRS comparisons for you. We're also providing heat mapping on the fly. And we're doing all this to where it's dissected in different ways that a precinct commander for a specific area can look at the information that's just relevant to them. For instance, if you have 4 precincts, like the agency that I came from, if you're displaying all this information in a CompStat meeting, 75% of what you're producing for that commander isn't even relative to them. All they want to know is what's important to me in my area. And that's what we're doing with analytics. And we're even applying natural language processing so that instead of asking questions in these CompStat meetings to an analyst that says, well, I'll get back to you, I'll have to run the reports and pull the information and create the analytics for you, that you can ask this of the systems yourself. That we're integrating Alexa technologies so that you can ask, show me all the burglaries that occurred within the last 2 weeks in Sector 3, and those analytics are automatically produced for you using business intelligence platforms. Would that make things a little more easy, a little more streamlined, help you understand what's actually happening inside of your community and how to deploy your resources? Sure it would. Another piece that we're doing. Right now, this is Guilford County in North Carolina, and we're actually using the military grid reference system. And this is a grid that applies across the entire world, and we're dividing it into 1 kilometer squares. And what you're seeing is the AI model looking through, and for every particular patrol area, it's selecting the top 3 grids where an incident is most likely to happen. And the colors don't indicate what type of incident is likely to happen. Instead, it's indicating what type of activity should be taking place by that officer while in that area. I've heard an officer say over and over again, when I was out there on the road and even when I had been promoted to command, look, I don't need to know why, just tell me where to go and what you want me to do when I get there. And this is exactly what we're doing with these artificial intelligence platforms now. And this updates every 24 hours as it's pulling new information out of your CAD system. And we're specific about the information that we're pulling out of your CAD system not to include self-initiated activity by the officers. One of the biggest arguments right now is that predictive policing and this type of AI implementation just magnifies the bias because of an officer's activity. That's why we're actually excluding officer activity. This information is how it's been reported specifically by the civilian population of where help is needed most. And that's where we're going to make sure that we put individuals. This also monitors how often the officer was in those prescribed areas, what type of activity they performed well inside of those areas, and measured what was the forecasted value of incidents to occur and what actually did occur. And so it continues to modify those types of activities until the AI model determines what is the best type of engagement with your community and your citizens inside of that zone in order to prevent crimes. Make sense? So we're not chasing after criminals anymore. What we're doing is we're protecting people from becoming victims. I think that's the true success of what we're trying to do with all these smart platforms. In addition to that, I want you to consider something about school shooters or active shooters, theaters, but I'm just going to kind of stay on school shooters for that matter. The first question we always ask after there's a mass shooting event is, why did they do it? I argue it doesn't matter. This isn't a mental health issue. School shooting is a problem with how we're designing our schools. People that aren't stable, that are looking to do maximum damage with minimum amount of resistance, are choosing schools because they can have absolutely, in their favor, a worst case scenario. Image on the left, your typical school, long hallways. Within those hallways are where the classrooms are. The only entry and exit in and out of those classrooms are into those long hallways. Is everybody familiar with the fatal funnel? Line of sight. And if we have a shooter positioned at that top area, my little pointer, up here, they've got view of nearly the entire school. And the potential victims have two options. Either enter into this funnel, where the shooter has obviously a commanding ability to cause maximum damage, or shelter in place. And I'm sorry, as law enforcement personnel, shelter in place to me sounds like fish in a barrel. And I don't think that's helping our victims in these situations, or potential victims. On the right is actually a school that's been designed by artificial intelligence. And I want you to notice a couple things about this. This has the same amount of square footage in classrooms as the image on the left. We haven't lost anything. We've actually used fewer building materials. The time in between classrooms has been decreased. We've reduced the amount of congestion in the hallways because they have ways to exit and enter different classrooms that are adjacent to each other. But in addition to that, we've also limited an active shooter's advantage, and we've created a harder target. I don't care why they're going through and shooting schools. I just want them to stop. And I think part of that is not addressing the symptom of mental health, but instead addressing the problem that we've created by having soft targets and not creating harder opportunities so that they don't choose schools at all. I mean, I'll say it, it's just like the military. They always have a plan. It may not always be the best plan, but they all have a coordinated plan. All the shifts, all the personnel are working from that plan. And the hard targets that they create, barricades leading up to those facilities. Yet we're leaving one of our most precious resources that we have in our nation, our children and our future, open to incredibly soft opportunities for threats to come in and cause a great deal of violence and harm. So, using AI platforms, we're now able to determine where to be, when to be there to prevent a crime from happening by officer presence, which we all agreed changes the behavior of individuals. We can design systems or schools and other venues that are much easier to defend. And as a result, the point isn't that we'll be able to contain an active shooter in this particular scenario, but that a shooter wouldn't choose a target like this anyway, because to them, there's no longer an advantage, right? Do you see the point? It just stops it all from happening altogether. So, moving forward, just a few more comments in conclusion, then I'll open it up for any questions that anybody may have. What's the real impact? I want to make sure I don't miss anything here. Smart Patrol, the AI platform that we're using for the different areas, that makes a new recruit effective immediately. One of the challenges that I had was I spent 12 weeks in the academy, 10 more weeks with a field training officer that was insufferable. Some of you are chuckling, you're probably very familiar with that. But then as soon as I was cut loose for solo patrol, I was sent out into an area that I was not familiar with, and the best advice I could get when I was asking my new peer officers of where are the areas that I need to be, they're like, you'll figure it out. I didn't know street names, I didn't know the roads, because it was an area that I had never even been in before. And that takes time. If we're applying technologies where we know officers to be placed so that we can prevent crimes from occurring, they're effective from day one. And that's one of the other things we're trying to do at Central Square is instead of designing complicated systems and then having extensive training programs that we have to send your personnel through in order to learn how to use what we're providing as a product, is we're designing systems that are intuitive, that are easy to understand, because we understand the attrition rate is nearly at 100%. And I experienced that personally in my agency. We were looking at about 300 applicants. Of that group, only about 10% would pass, and after 3 years, we only had 1% remaining. So we had 300 applicants, and after 3 years of going through the academy and training, we only had 3 out of that original applicant pool that was working for the department. Now when we have a group of 30 individuals, because they were setting up the academy for every 30 individuals going through, that's 6 months until they become productive, because they got 12 weeks of academy and up to 12 weeks of FTO. We were also losing officers at a rate of 5 every month. So the same 6 months it took to get 30 officers out into solo patrol, we lost 30 officers. There's adequate number of allotted personnel, we just don't have the people to fill those particular positions. So having programs that don't require these massive training schedules also helps and is a benefit. Smart Patrol and showing, I'm going to go back to that real quick. This is a coordinated plan where in the blue is actually Greensboro PD, and what you see in the surrounding yellow is the Guilford County Sheriff's Office. So now those agencies by default, because they're both using the same AI platform, have a coordinated plan where they're working together to suppress crime. And because this constantly evolves, as your criminal patterns move around, so will the application, and this is delivered directly to the officer's terminal. And remember me talking about success of an arrest? We can't just take that away from an officer, because then they're not going to feel successful if they can't make arrests. So what we're doing is actually we're incentivizing this to where they can see how many times they've entered into those areas and the activities that they've performed, and how it compares to their peers that are also out patrolling those same areas. And then you as an agency can incentivize that program so that your officers are engaged and you have a message that you're delivering directly to your end user personnel about where to go, when to be there, what to do once you get into that area, and how important it is that you continue to do that, and we're not chasing after the arrests and then continuing to swell that court pipeline of criminal justice. In addition, it's a decreased risk to officers and citizens. It reduces the saturated process flow of that criminal justice system, as I just mentioned. It increases the amount of time that you have available for patrol. Right now, if all you're doing is answering calls, that's all the time you have to do, is answer calls. Once you start employing a system like this and preventing crimes, your call volume is going to drop. If call volume drops, then you have more time available for officer presence. More time available for officer presence because it's a coordinated plan. Because an officer, think about it, if they work 40 hours a week, and there's 168 hours a week, they're only out there for 24% of the time anyway. So an officer on one shift deciding to do one thing and another shift deciding to do something else, there's no coordinated, effective end goal in place. It's going to default naturally to them thinking an arrest is a success because they don't have another plan in mind. And these systems help bring your agency back together and have a coordinated effort, again, to prevent victimization from happening in the first place. If we think about some other things that are going on, AI video or artificial intelligence in video, video has increased the amount of data that's flowing through your agency by nearly 100% or more. And what's happening with that video right now? We've been talking to some agencies where they've had to hire up to 20 additional personnel just to process the video. And that's for freedom of information, or whether it's for a defense or a prosecutor. That's a lot of additional personnel for budgets that continue to either remain neutral or shrink year after year after year. So we're looking at technologies now where we can apply AI video so that it's actually indexing and cataloging video so that it's easier for you to use, not in a forensic capacity, but more in an investigative capacity, but also so that it starts detecting crimes before they happen as well. If we see an individual in a parking lot going up to multiple cars, do we think that they forgot which car is theirs, so they're trying to key in every different car? Or what do we think is really happening? From the experience of law enforcement, that individual is looking for which car they're going to break into. AI can now see that in video and go ahead and start dispatching officers to that location, hopefully preventing the crime from occurring in the first place. One of the impacts that we saw in areas that have high incidence of crime is it has an eroding effect to your economic community. Because if high crime means that there's going to be high insurance rates for businesses. So if businesses aren't there, you don't have employment. And if employment's not there, it can't sustain a resident population. And if you don't have residents, you don't have property tax. And if there's no property tax, then how do you support your government services, including public safety, to include fire, EMS, and law? By preventing those crimes, we can lower those insurance rates, we can get individuals back into your communities, and we can prevent people from becoming victims, but in doing so, also welcome businesses back into the area. Camden had some great numbers that they provided yesterday about the significant change that they've had because they've changed how they train their personnel. Part of their training program is every officer as a recruit for 3 weeks goes door to door introducing themselves to the communities that they're policing so those individuals know who they are, and we're building that public trust back up one house at a time. He admitted not every house is happy to see a cop because not a whole lot of communities want to be known with talking to the police. But it's an effort that we have to make on the law enforcement side. It's not going to happen on the civilian side. A couple more comments and then I'll be happy to get to the questions. The other thing that we're going to apply is the Internet of Things. How many of you have gone online and, I don't know, shopped for a mattress or just browsed for a mattress on several different websites, but then you go to Facebook and what's over in the margin? A bunch of ads for mattresses, right? Okay, how do we apply that to public safety? One of the things that we're working on is that we have an intelligent investigator that when a significant event occurs, whether it's a shooting, a stabbing, or a homicide, that it goes ahead and starts combing through your records management system, taking a look at that particular area, known names that are associated with that particular residence, any events that have happened within the last 2 or 3 weeks, and starts feeding the investigator, even before they've arrived on scene to begin conducting their interviews, a handful of details that are important and helping them understand so that they're not getting on scene and just asking general questions like, did you see who did it? Did you see what they were driving? Do you know what direction they left in? So that we're going ahead and giving those investigators information the minute they start investigating that particular incident, rather than sometimes days or even weeks later. So we're increasing that solvability rate. If we can process these people and make arrests for incidents that they've committed in a much faster time, I think we'll also see an additional decrease. Because if you look at the number of arrests that you have in your agency versus the actual number of incidents that take place, what we see is we're only apprehending individuals for about 1 out of every 25 to 30 crimes anyway. I don't know about you, but if I was going to win 24 out of every 25 times in Vegas, I'm going to double down, right? And that's a culture that these perpetrators now have, is that has become a cost of doing business for them is apprehension. They expect at some point it's going to happen, but the criminal justice system, again, is only catching them for 24 out of every 25 events. When they do go through the system, I think that's why we see the recidivism rates that are over 75% high. They have no more guilt or a conviction of conscience than you or I had coming here today to IACP. We're several generations into these perpetrator cultures, and that's just how they conduct their lives. That's just what they saw their families do when they were growing up, and so it's just generally accepted from them. So continuing to chase perpetrators isn't going to work. What we have to do is suppress those environments. I often use the example that areas like Atlanta, Chicago, Detroit, LA, Miami, perpetrators from around the world didn't think, you know what, that looks like a great place to go commit crimes, I'm going to move there. No, what happened is those areas, because of the cultures and the way that things have always been done in those areas, propagate an environment that supports criminal activity. If we can get in there and prevent those crimes from happening in the first place, again, through officer presence, then what we're doing is we're changing that environment so that it isn't successful for crime, But then at that same point, we also need to make sure that we're providing them an alternate opportunity. It's so easy for them to commit crimes right now that that's what they default to. It's easier than getting a job. We've got to make it more difficult for them to commit a crime so that it's easier to get a job and actually become a productive member. These are going to be some fundamental changes. We didn't get into this mess in just 10 years, and we're not going to get out of it in just 10 years. But this is how we're trying to leverage technology so that you understand there's a great wealth of richness within the data that everybody is collecting and how you can apply that to your resources. So, if you want to supplement your staffing, if you want to attract a higher quality of candidates, I think part of the issue that we're having right now is we have these dwindling applicant pools or candidates to choose from. Part of that issue is because those numbers are so low, we're having to relax the standards on what we're willing to hire into a police agency or a law enforcement agency. That what used to be absolutely intolerable offenses of drug use or criminal record have now been relaxed to say, okay, well, as long as you haven't done any drugs within the last year, or as long as you haven't committed any crimes within the last 3 years, in order just to have enough candidates to try and keep your attrition rate from not being entirely in the negative, just so you can remain neutral. But part of that is our systems are so far behind in terms of how law enforcement is using technology is that we're not attracting candidates to go into that field. What they see on CSI or NCIS or pick any number of television shows is once they actually get inside and understand some agencies are still doing reports by hand, or they'll do the reports on a laptop but then print it off in order for it to be submitted because they don't have a functioning records management system. They don't even know how to operate in that environment. And that's the difference between digital immigrants and digital natives. I don't know how many of you remember this, but I remember phones that used to be connected to the wall with a cord, right? And you really had something if you had one of those long cords where you could go into a closet and talk privately, otherwise the whole family heard what you were saying. Now, these people don't know any world that didn't exist without cell phones and absolutely having every bit of technology available to them in the palm of their hand. And what we're seeing is the public is demanding for solutions that we haven't provided yet. Just in Hurricane Florence, individuals weren't able to make contact with 911, so they started tweeting out, our house is flooding, we're going up to the attic, send help now. For anybody who could see that, hoping that public safety or at least somebody was watching those Twitter feeds. And I think that shows that we're not prepared for the technological expectations of the communities that we're supposed to be policing. Just 2 days ago, I saw an article where a woman had been killed. The last person that they had seen with her was their stepfather, but they assumed it wasn't him because he said he had left hours and they didn't discover the body for several days later. One of the investigators saw that she had a Fitbit on. So he went and looked and discovered the Fitbit showed her pulse rate, and then it showed when her pulse rate stopped. And that was the time he had been seen leaving the home shortly thereafter. And so now they were able to identify him as a suspect. I don't know where that's going to go. That's a case that's still in process right now. But these technological advancements and looking at new ways to use technology is going to change the way law enforcement works. And if we continue to have a mindset of, well, that's just not the way we've ever done it, or we're just going to keep doing it that way because that's what we're comfortable with, isn't going to work anymore, and we're already seeing the effect of that. Just a few years ago, where I expected technology to be now has far exceeded what I could have possibly imagined, and especially with the advent of artificial intelligence. And what we're going to see in just 3 to 5 years' time, we have no idea. We think we know what's coming, we don't. And I'm not saying that for law enforcement, I'm saying that for just populations in general. Artificial intelligence, we've just scratched the surface, and once we really get a hold of what this capability is, it's going to fundamentally change how we function as a society, and it's going to fundamentally require that law enforcement changes as well, and how we apply ourselves in protecting our citizens. Okay, that's about what I've got. Does anybody have any questions? We're over at booth 2312. Please come by and see some of the technologies that we have. Feel free to reach out and contact us. Again, business intelligence, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things applied for public safety is the directions that we're going, and we're going to continue to look for new ways. And please let us know if there's anything we can do to help you. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.